I guess we can just talk about how we're finally doing this.
Yeah, I also was going to write like an intro paragraph that we could do each
Oh,
episode, and then I
yeah.
didn't do that.
Hey,
So
it's the
everyone,
first episode.
every
It's okay.
everyone, look forward to next time
Next time
when
we'll
we
have
open
it.
with a fun little "Here's what the show's about."
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? What's the real truth about Citizen Kane?
It'll probably turn out to be a very simple thing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Parker.
And I'm Max.
And we are going to be your hosts for Better Than Citizen Kane. And what we're kind of hoping to do with the show is basically both of us have a film background. We met in film school, and anybody who is interested in film or talks about film will inevitably come across people telling you that Citizen Kane is the greatest film ever made. And
Yes.
we've talked about it a lot, and we kind of feel differently, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the. It's not like we hate Citizen Kane.
No.
It's not just, so that we don't lose anybody right from the beginning if they're like, oh man,
Ugh, no,
ugh,
not from me.
ugh. I want to do two things. If you are listening and you are like, God, I hate film bros. Hopefully not what we're doing here. I hope we don't come
Yeah.
across that way. I like to think that we aren't that kind of like I was reading reviews of Citizen Kane, and it's people being like, and the cinematography and the use of, and it's like, we're not, well, maybe throw that around sometimes, but we're not
Sure.
gonna, this isn't like cinema is, like it's not
Well,
that.
I mean, if any of you dear listeners need like a palette setup of what to expect, inevitably we will be comparing Citizen Kane to the Herbie films and at least a couple Muppet movies. So like that's the kind of film bros that we are.
Yeah, we're yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, eventually we will be doing that, and I look forward to those episodes.
Those
And
will
the
be good.
second thing is, if you are someone who is, kind of an avid film viewer and lover who's like, Citizen Kane is the greatest film ever made, we're not trying to dispute that for you. This is a very subjective show. This is very much a show that is, hey, we just think it's a bit silly to say that the best movie ever made was 80 years ago, and saying, that's the peak of what cinema can do and what film can do. But I was thinking about it a lot rewatching Citizen Kane,
Mhm.
of like, it's off, at least it was on top of it might still be on top of the AFI 100. I think it is.
I think
don't
it
think
is,
it's
yeah.
been dethroned over here yet. It's been dethroned across the pond, the BFI.
Sure.
But here it's like, that's still the greatest American film ever made. And that's something that I kind of think needs to be looked at and needs to be updated. What do
Sure.
you say to that, Parker?
No, absolutely. And that's, that's the premise of the show, is that each week we're going to be looking at a movie, whether it's a movie that we like, whether it's a movie that people talk about a lot, whether it's a movie that's just come out. That's a big thing for us, is we want to make sure that, we like film history, but we also want to kind of keep it contemporary. So we're going to be looking at newer movies as well. But the whole point of this is that the standard is going to be every single week we're going to be talking about Citizen Kane.
which I kind of realized as I was finishing up this rewatch of the movie, where I was like, I have to talk about this every other week now.
Yeah,
And I'll have to revisit this a few other times throughout, just to continue to.
probably.
And there was one small part of me that was like, oh, I don't want to do
Yeah,
that.
is it too late to back out?
couldn't we change the podcast? But no, I think that it is, I think honestly that it is a fun discussion to be had, and I hope that it's entertaining to listen to and for people to chime in on.
Sure.
Of like, yeah, is Citizen Kane still the most important and technically well made and societally relevant, socially relevant film in American history, but also one of the greats in the world? And I just think that that's something that is kind of interesting to look at in the year 2023. It's been it's been almost 80 years. I started
41.
It's 41.
Yeah, so it is.
Okay, so it's over 80
82
years.
this year. Yeah.
Wow. Happy
Mhm.
82nd birthday to this movie that I think is fine.
Well, if you're still with us, if any of you haven't just turned off who are diehard Citizen Kane
How dare they
defenders.
say such heresy?
But yeah, that's kind of the shape of things.
Yeah, and this week, as you know from the episode title and from when you clicked on the episode, this week it's Vertigo. We're looking at 1958's Vertigo, and I do know the year that came out.
Oh, good.
I know that.
Right. So our reasoning for Vertigo is that we're recording this January of 2023. So, our time as of recording. About a month or two ago, Sight and Sound released their updated top 100 films of all time. And on that list, Citizen Kane ranked third, and the movie above it, directly above it, was Vertigo at number two.
And the BFI does this Sight and Sound magazine, and every 10 years they update the list. So the last time it was updated was 2012. And that was the first time that Vertigo had surpassed Citizen Kane to be number one, with Citizen Kane being number two, from what I understand. This year, in 2022, at the top of the list is the French movie. It's the French movie. It's the
You got the title?
Well, it's Jean it's Jean something, and then it's her address, and I'm sorry to everyone out there who loves that film. One, we're not starting with that. Not because we, again, we're setting ourselves up for some thoughts from our audience. It's not, we're not avoiding that movie because we're like, it shouldn't be number one.
Well, I think we just wanted to tackle something a little more well-known for the first episode.
There we go. That's the better way of putting it.
Is that I'm sure it's a great film and it's a movie that we want to cover on the podcast at some
Absolutely.
point, especially because, it is one that has definitively been said by, film scholars the world over as being better than Citizen Kane. So we want to talk about it.
Absolutely.
But mostly we thought that might be kind of an inaccessible first starting point.
Yeah, to be like, if the first episode's title was that film's title, it wouldn't be super accessible for people beyond like film schools, I don't think.
Sure.
So I think starting with Vertigo is the way to go. And there we go. I just lost the rest of our listeners.
There we go. There, everybody's out. Jumped ship. It's over.
That means no one's going to be here to hear my very good joke that I came up with watching Vertigo last night.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
So, for anybody who doesn't know, Vertigo, as Max was saying, is a 1958 film directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak. And people other than us, other than two guys who decided to, start a podcast, which is, I think that might be, the same way that like our parents' generation, the equivalent of like a midlife crisis is that your dad buys a sports car or something.
Yeah.
I think our generation's like quarter life crisis is everybody starts a podcast. So all this to say that like people outside of us have decided that Vertigo is better than Citizen Kane, but we're going to look at it and make up our own minds.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm assuming that if you're listening to this, you at least know some things about Citizen Kane. But in case you don't, it is a 1941 film directed by Orson Welles, his directorial debut. Orson Welles got his start in radio. You might have heard his name in the same sentence as War of the Worlds. He rather notoriously did a very fun radio production of War of the Worlds that may or may not have caused a lot of people to panic. That's probably blown out of proportion from what I understand. But yeah, this was his directorial debut. It is often considered a technical marvel, especially when compared to its peers of the time, other films of its kind. In the early 40s, and even now, people are, and I'll admit, Citizen Kane looks really, really good. But the question is, does Vertigo look better? No.
Yeah, so our three grading criteria we're going to be looking at these films through is basically, first and foremost, is it either technically or historically significant? Is it pushing the boundaries of filmmaking? Is it making a big statement within film history? Did it have an impact and its influence is felt? That's kind of our first category.
Right.
The second category is, does it connect on like an emotional level? Like personally, and that's going to be the most, subjective one for us.
Absolutely.
As two viewers, when we're watching this movie, do we connect with it? Are we engaged with it? Like, are we pulled in on that side of things? The third one is every movie is aware of what it is to a certain level.
Right.
I think Roger Ebert, we're kind of stealing this from Roger Ebert because his big thing was like, how well is the movie doing what it's supposed to be doing? Like, how well is it achieving what it's trying to achieve?
Yes.
So that's kind of our third criteria is,
Right.
okay, looking at it and saying, this is the goal that it feels like the filmmaker had. Did they achieve that?
Right, which I like that one as a companion to the other two because one of, the technical aspect and the historical significance aspect is objective. That's the question. That's how things like Birth of a Nation get put on important film lists when really
Right.
we shouldn't, you don't have to watch. But historically, I guess if you wanted to see how, the president showed it in the White House and like not single-handedly, but like brought back the KKK. You could look at it that way.
Sure.
But emotionally, it's boring, and also I hate it.
Yeah, fair.
But so, objectively, these films are important. So that's the objective aspect. The subjective aspect, of course, is, are we engaged with it? Do we think it's boring? Do we think it's bad? Do we love it? Does it make us cry? Does it make us tense? That sort of question. And then that third kind of criteria on the rubric, if you will, is kind of a bridge between those two of like, what do we personally think that it is, like, objectively, does that make sense? Like, it kind of feels like a nice third. Yeah. So do you like Citizen Kane, Parker?
Okay, so I have been like, I got interested in film fairly young. I knew I wanted to be involved in film in some capacity at the age of probably 6 or 7. But I didn't really start watching movies a lot, like searching out big movies until I was probably 12 or 13. So I think that was the first time I watched Citizen Kane, was everybody's like, this is the big one. This is the one you got to watch. So I've had the past 13 years of my life to grapple with this movie. And I can tell you that from a filmmaking standpoint and like a film history standpoint, I love it. Like, genuinely, I think it is really well made. I think it's gorgeous to look at. Like, that was the big takeaway from this most recent rewatch, is I'm like, man, there's a lot of really good shots in this. Like, it's this gorgeous black and white cinematography, and this amazing deep focus going on, and like, it just looks so good. Taken on its own, I like the writing a lot. Like, there's a lot of like particular pieces of dialogue that I think are really good.
Yeah, I picked up on that this time too. There were a few things where I was like, I really like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like on all the technical levels, I think it's a really good movie, and I do enjoy it from that technical side. As an audience member, I've never really cared for it. Mostly it just doesn't grab me. There's just I don't care about him. I don't really care about the people in his life. I think the framework of the reporter is kind of wasted. I think we could have done more to like make him a character. But that's kind of my general feelings on the film, is that I can 100% appreciate it. And there's going to be movies we talk about that are worse than Citizen Kane. Easily.
Absolutely.
Like, that's no doubt in my mind. But I also think that like some of my own personal feelings attached to it might be related back to like, it doesn't need to be as big as everybody makes it, maybe.
Yeah. I guess that's an interesting point of like, if this wasn't consistently like the Citizen Kane of movies, if it wasn't consistently that, if you heard about this, a la, we're both pretty big fans of Out of the Past, that noir film starring Robert Mitchum. And like that, when I put that in and I watched it, I was like, oh, wow, like I hadn't heard that much about it. And now I know that it is considered one of the better noir films, but I had not heard about it. I was kind of blown away by it. Do you think that would be the case with Citizen Kane? I mean, obviously you might not be as engaged, but do you think that there's an element of build up around it that when you sit down to watch it, you're kind of like, I wish that I was engaging more with this as like a story?
Totally. Because like a good comparison point for me is last year I watched A Matter of Life and Death for the first time, which I'd sort of like heard of in passing, but knew nothing about it. And then I watched it and I was blown away on all the ways that like I'm sure I would have been blown away by Citizen Kane watching it for the first time, knowing next to nothing. Is that like the use of practical effects is amazing in that movie, and it's so pretty to look at. It's this gorgeous Technicolor, vision that is being put on screen. But I think it benefited from me not really knowing anything about it, because I'm sure what happened, I don't remember the exact, timing or my exact emotional response. But thinking back on it, I imagine the first time I watched this when I was probably 13 was just, that's the greatest movie of all time. Like, I think I just got it so blown out of proportion for me. And I've tried to adjust as the years gone on, and I found kind of my equilibrium of appreciating on a technical level, but just accepting the fact that I'm never going to connect with it personally.
Sure.
What about you? What's your experience with the film?
I have seen this film twice. I watched it for the first time, I think, in late 2019 with my parents. We were kind of going through, I was living at home at the time while I was going to college. And we were just kind of working our way through a lot of the movies on the AFI. I had never seen it before, and I don't think my parents had ever seen it before. And so we put it on. And I think part of it was like we watched it at like 4 p.m. on a Sunday, which is like peak boredom hours. So like maybe I didn't give it a fair chance. So I was excited to come back to it a little bit, as excited as I can be as someone who, for the most part, thinks this movie is fine. And I went back into it, and immediately, like, again, on this watch, the first little bit of it, I was actually pretty captivated by. I think that the news on March, I think that goes on for a little bit too long, especially if you don't know where it's going. You're like, is this the whole movie? And like, why are you telling us his whole life right at the start? Which is like an admirable and very interesting choice to be like, okay, we're going to tell you right from the top his entire life story. And then we're going to go and we're going to dive back into these parts at different points. And you're going to get this complete picture of Charles Foster Kane. And I was like, okay, I'm on board with this time, because last time I watched it, it was 4 p.m. on a Sunday. Right. And now I'm watching it like at night in my room. And I was like, wow, the black and white looks fantastic. This movie looks incredible. And then, I really like that scene just right at the start, right when the newsreel finishes and all the reporters are kind of cracking wise and they're all kind of making fun of it. And it feels really natural. Like it's a very natural kind of conversation about it. And then at the end, they assign Thompson to go to Atlantic City and talk to Kane's second wife and like try and figure out what Rosebud was. I love that establishing of like, because I don't know, as someone who I read a lot of historical biographies. I read a lot of books that are about things like this, where like, if this were like a New York Times article that were like, hey, this guy just died and his last words were Rosebud, I would be all over that. If there was a book about it, I might pick it up. And so I really liked that angle. I still really like that angle. But I think that the movie loses me about halfway through when, it's Thompson goes to Bernstein first, I think, right? He goes to Bernstein first. And then he goes to Leland, right? Is Leland the one who's in the hospital, right?
Yes.
Leland's so then he goes to Leland. And like through there, I was like, okay, this is actually pretty interesting. I really like this. And then once we get into the like heavy governor stuff and the affair stuff in particular, I think that the movie kind of loses me. I don't really know what it is. I mean, I think I might know what it is, but that just kind of loses me. And then I'm kind of not engaged for a lot of it, because at that point, I don't know what it is about it. I don't know.
It was really interesting because this time around, I watched it with my wife, Kate, who hasn't seen it before.
Sure.
So that was really interesting, like getting the experience for her fresh pair of eyes. And what I was going to say earlier was she literally said verbatim what you said about the newsreel. Is she turned to me, she's like, is the whole movie like this? Like, is the whole movie presented to you in newscasts? Because she's like, that's kind of a lot. I was like, no, it wraps up, and kind of explained to her. I was like, everything you just got, we're going to go back over for the next like hour and a half. Because she's like, that's a lot of information all at once. Like, that's a lot. Right. Am I expected to like remember these things? Do I need to know these people? I was like, no, it's going to go through each of those things kind of one at a time, but it's going to give you a quick, rapid fire of everything, which I think I like it. I agree. I think it goes on just a touch too long. Yeah, it's interesting at first of watching the reporter go around and talk to all of these people, but then once you hit all the governor race and everything else, it does grind to a halt, because it's only the one witness at that point. He's only getting one person's perspective, and it stays on that for a long time.
That's the thing, is that we're kind of stuck in that part and with that specific like witness and that kind of account for.
Is it Susan? Is that his second name?
And just kind of like for the rest of the movie, we're there. And I think that like you said, it kind of slows down for me. It feels like we lose momentum And also the actions that we're seeing him do are kind of awful, and you don't like seeing it, of him, yelling at Susan and just being really kind of a miserable person, which is interesting to me because at the start of the movie, and I'd forgotten about this, but like at the start of the movie, we have like we kind of see him take over the Inquirer, right? And then it jumps a little bit forward and he's talking to Thatcher and Bernstein, I think.
Yeah.
And he's saying, if I hadn't been made rich, I would have been a great man. And I'm like, okay, so like when you're in like your mid 40s, 50s, you're aware of that. And I think that that's really interesting. And that is kind of like the summary of the movie, right? It's like at the end, it's like, well, he just wishes that he could have lived a normal life because isn't he miserable even though he has everything he could ever want? And it's like, yeah, I get it. like one, you told me earlier, and two, I get it. And then it's not very fun and this is something that I was texting you about right after we watched it, was like,
right.
When he starts being a miserable person and he starts, he's trashing the room after Susan leaves, in that scene, I'm not sitting there thinking, no, Charles, please, this isn't you. Like, I'm not sitting there like, or I'm not even like, oh, this is interesting. He's turning, it's not like he's been that great for a while, Right. So I just think that it kind of just ends on like this sour note where it's like, oh, and he sucks now, but he wishes he could go back to his childhood and he wishes he hadn't been brought into all of this. Right. Is that your reading of Rosebud? Is that the correct reading?
That's what I get out of it, is just like Rosebud being representative of a time without responsibility and a time of like simpler base joys, I guess. It's one of those things of like, the more times I've watched it and more times I've thought about it over the years, like, I think the reveal just kind of loses a lot of its air as it goes on in the movie, like kind of think about it. Because at first, I think on a first watch, and I'm sure to like audiences in 1941, it's like, wow, this man has everything. But the thing he was thinking about was like his childhood sled.
Yeah, right. And I think that's the other thing, is that we have exclusively lived in a post-Citizen Kane world. And again, that's where the historical significance and the technical significance and like the history around this movie plays a huge part in why it's so important. Is like, in 1941, to be watching this movie about a rich newspaper tycoon, you're not that far removed from the days of like newspaper tycoons.
Well, even that, it's a 1-to-1 to William Randolph Hearst. So
absolutely.
Like that's modern of that time audiences are going into that film with that knowledge, and that would be like us watching Glass Onion if like the Elon Musk metaphor was cranked up to 11.
Sure.
It'd be like, whoa, he's doing that. Like he's actually going there.
Right. Yeah, because again, this is kind of a big diss movie on William Randolph Hearst and just like calling him out. And again, like that element of it is like, yeah, sure, I can see why that's such a big deal. And like, again, it's well made. It's a really well made diss track on William Randolph Hearst. And I guess at the time you would have been like, oh, well, I'd never thought that a rich man could be so miserable. And it's like, yeah, but we've lived in, the 50s. We've lived with media from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And like everything where it's like, no, we get it. I do wish that I could kind of let go of like my pre-existing cultural understanding of like rich people.
Sure.
And like, I'm sure that if I was like completely like someone who's like, wow, celebrities are awesome, rich people are super cool, and they just must be so happy up there. I'm just, I'm an American. And it's like, yeah, but I don't know, like even if they did, even if they made Citizen Kane now about like Elon Musk or about something like that, we are also on Twitter. Like we have constant access to these people's thoughts and feelings and like 24-hour news coverage, which I do think is something that's really interesting about Citizen Kane, is that Kane's big pitch for the Inquirer is 24-hour news. And they're like, you can't do news for 24 hours. And I'm like, that's interesting. And in that way, I can see why you'd be like, yeah, it's a great American film because it kind of sets up what we would go on to do, and it's commenting on our worshiping of billionaires and of millionaires and of rich people.
Yeah,
right?
So like that's kind of another hiccup for me is, one, I hear a lot of people pull the Hearst card of saying like, this is important because of the historical context. I'm like, cool, that's great, very interesting. I don't know that makes it a good movie. Like, I don't know that makes it the greatest film of all time. It's an interesting factoid. I saw somebody, because Kate was tweeting about watching the movie, and somebody in her comments said something really interesting, which was like, that they find Citizen Kane to be infinitely more interesting as a historical artifact than a film.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I can totally see that. Like, that side of Citizen Kane discussion is very interesting to me. And like hearing about the making of the film and hearing about how Hearst hated it. The Drunk History episode's really good about the making of this movie.
And Mank is not that good.
I never saw Mank.
I haven't seen the Drunk History episode, but I'm sure you'd have more fun watching Drunk History.
I'm sure, I can guarantee you will.
Than watching Mank.
That's something I hear a lot, and I think you have to separate them, at least for me. I'm like, I don't think the historical context adds to the movie as a movie, but also, like you were talking about, given our context and everything that, the media sphere that we exist in, I just don't know how I'm supposed to feel about Kane. Because I'm like, okay, if it's a diss track, are we dunking on him the whole time? Or you're just to be like, look at this schmuck who has everything and is unhappy? Or are we supposed to feel
Are we
something
supposed to
for
sympathize?
Him? Yeah, are we supposed to sympathize?
I think that's one of my big questions about Citizen Kane and Vertigo is, are we meant to sympathize with the central character?
Yeah.
That's something that I was thinking about watching these films was like, what is there, going into our point of, is this movie doing what it's trying to do well?
Yeah.
Of like, does Citizen Kane want us to feel bad for him? At the end, are we supposed to feel bad for him? Is it supposed to be a tragedy of like, oh, he just wants his sled? He wants, that's the simplified version.
He's just a little guy.
He's just a little guy.
You're going to be mad at us.
You're going to be mad at a little guy? He's just a goofy little guy. He got sold to a bank when he was a child.
No, but that is a really good question. And I think it's something that, we queued up Vertigo based solely off of the Sight and Sound list, but I was thinking about that last night watching Vertigo. It's like, oh, this actually is a really nice starting point because of the parallels. Specifically, something you mentioned earlier was watching that scene at the end when he's like wrecking Susan's room, and you're like, there's no part of me that's like, no, Charlie, like this isn't you.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because there's a very similar scene at the end of Vertigo
there is.
That I do feel that way kind of, where I'm like, oh no, like Jimmy Stewart, what are you doing?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I don't know, the very interesting parallels there.
Yes.
That I'm excited to talk about.
And I think we can kind of move into Vertigo a little bit. I mean, we have the rest of this show to talk about Citizen Kane. Every episode, we're going to be bringing up our thoughts on Citizen Kane on some level.
Yeah.
So I think I'm good leaving it there. Of like, that's kind of the questions that's what was on my mind going into Vertigo, because I watched Citizen Kane on Thursday, watched Vertigo on Friday, and going into Vertigo, I remember loving Vertigo the first time that I saw it. I remember, I watched that within like a few weeks with my parents. Once again, we were working our way through the AFI, their list, and we watched Vertigo. And at the end, like my parents and I, like our full read of it was like, that was so much better than Citizen Kane. What are you talking about? We were like, that was fantastic. And then a few months ago, I was in like a screenwriting class, like a screenwriting lab, and someone had come in and she had just seen Vertigo, and she said that she hated it. And she was like, I don't understand how people can like this movie that is like, it makes women into objects, and it is, it's asking you to root for a man who is basically, stalking and then like harassing this woman.
Yeah.
And I was confused because in my head, you're not supposed to root for Jimmy Stewart in that movie.
No, I don't think so.
You are not meant to watch him, especially after spoilers for Vertigo, especially after he comes out of the mental hospital after Madeleine's death. It's not like he's coming out and we're supposed to be like, and it makes sense that he's asking Judy to do all these things. He's right to do this. He deserves that woman, like we're not supposed to feel that way, right? Like it's a psychological thriller / horror, right? Like that's the horror element that Hitchcock is playing into. Is it's not just about a man who is tricked. It is, how does that affect his mind, right?
Right.
Is that your read of the film?
I completely agree. And like, holding space for that person in your screenwriting class, like that's a whole other can of worms that I'm sure we're going to get into in the show. Of,
Absolutely.
my baseline is Hitchcock is a brilliant director. He's a scumbag human being.
I don't want to sound like I'm like, I think this movie's perfect. No, I think that, and there's a lot of letterboxd reviews about that. There's a lot of people talking about, like Hitchcock's treatment of women and in film and in real life. And I don't want to invalidate that because I think that's completely fair. My one thing was just, I never thought that I was supposed to like Scotty's actions. I never once just assumed, because I thought it was like they got Jimmy Stewart to do that because that helps kind of curate kind of that feeling in you type. Of like, what are you doing? Like, you're Jimmy Stewart, right? Sorry.
Yeah. So no, I completely agree. I do, like, my feeling watching it is that the movie doesn't want you rooting for Scotty. Especially in the second half. And I think that's what's really interesting watching it again, because I had a really funny exchange with our producer, Will, who is, one half of the Odd Bros, but I was texting about the movie and he was asking me how it was. I said, it's good. I said, definitely, like, having watched Citizen Kane yesterday, like, it's definitely better than that, in my opinion. It was really funny because he texted me and he said, I was thinking about it today. I truly find watching Vertigo to be agonizing. He's like, I like the movie, but I can only watch it every decade or so. And I was like, yeah, honestly, I kind of feel that same way, because the last time I revisited this was probably like 2015. Like, it's been probably about 8 years, mostly because if I need to, like, scratch that Hitchcock itch, usually I go to Psycho or North by Northwest. Those are
absolutely, those are super.
I really like.
Yeah, I agree. I really like those. And if we're looking at his earlier career, I am a big fan of The Lady Vanishes. I think that's a super really fun movie. Yeah,
I'd realized that I wasn't really sure how I felt about the movie, because we talked about doing it for the show, and I was like, yeah, Vertigo. I've seen Vertigo. And then watching it again, I was like, yeah, I'm kind of in the same vein as Will, where I'm like, I don't think I need to watch it again for a few years. Not because, like, I dislike it, but it's kind of exhausting in some ways. Like, it's just a lot all at once.
Yeah.
I also just, like, I'm not a fan of movies where, like, women are treated horribly as they are in this movie. And so it's I can appreciate it. I'll hold space for it. I like it more than I like Citizen Kane on a personal level. But yeah, same sort of thing of just, I'm like, man, this is kind of a downer. This is a lot.
And this is something that I wrote this question down. I had this fun little San Francisco notebook that I have.
Oh, very nice.
That I hadn't been using, and it was kind of fun to use it while watching Vertigo.
Sure.
Because, man, let's just get this out of the way. Vertigo is gorgeous.
It's so
Vertigo,
pretty.
like the colors and kind of the softness of it,
pretty.
absolutely like turns like San Francisco was like the place for noir films, and in black and white it looks dark and like, wow, like it's a perfect setting for that. And then Vertigo is in and of itself kind of a noir film, just not in style necessarily. It's got obviously like color and that sort of thing, but it makes San Francisco look beautiful. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if that influenced San Francisco's portrayal in film for the rest of time.
I'm sure,
because I feel that is the portrayal of San Francisco, is like, look at how pretty it is, look at this. And it is kind of, when you go there, I don't know, I really like San Francisco.
Yeah.
But a question came to mind while I was watching this beautiful movie. Why do two of the greatest films of all time heavily center around the abuse and mistreatment of women?
That's a good question.
Why is it that those are and obviously it comes down to, as we've talked about, technical marvel. You talk about historical significance, you talk about, the directors behind it.
Sure.
But it's a question that is kind of also always on my mind, just in how male-centric director lists are, and how film bros in particular will talk about their favorite directors, of like, Tarantino, like, you get into Kubrick, you get into Hitchcock, you get it, and it's just kind of like, why are two of the greatest films of all time? It's interesting to me. I don't know if that has anything to do with the reading of them, but that kept coming back to me as I was thinking about Vertigo last night and this morning. Was just like, that's interesting to me.
Yeah, it is interesting. And it's interesting you should bring that up, because that was a really unexpected reaction that I saw when the Sight and Sound list came up, is that a lot of people were like genuinely upset that Portrait of a Lady on Fire was on the list. And in my opinion, I'm like, yeah, it's an incredible movie. Like, I love that film, and it's something we want to talk about on the show at some point. But like, every time I saw people's pushback on it, not all of them, obviously, like I don't want to pull a blanket statement, but like a lot of the reactions and takes I was seeing had kind of that like misogynistic underpinning to it of just like, well, you know, that could have been a spot for John Ford, or that could have been a spot for Tarantino, or that could have been a spot for Fincher. I'm like, yeah, but it's not.
Yeah.
Like it's a spot for her.
Yeah, I don't know. And it's just kind of like interesting to look at, and in this conversation of like, you know, we're asking the question, is Vertigo better than Citizen Kane? And this time, you know, I gave them both the same review because I really think that I do like Vertigo more. So in my mind, it is better than Citizen Kane. But I do think that and obviously it's just tricky for me. It's tricky for me to decide because in my mind, I'm like, well, Citizen Kane is historically more significant. But also Vertigo developed the Vertigo technique, you know, the dolly zoom.
Yeah.
And it also, you know, it's a Hitchcock film, and it's one of, you know, it's kind of like, it's got the Saul Bass, you know, poster and intro, and it's fantastic. And I think I like it more just because I can't really pin down why. I don't know. It's just interesting. Like you were saying earlier, I didn't realize how kind of similar my thoughts were leaving both movies until I finished them. And then I was like, are we supposed to like him? And and I feel bad for the women in these movies.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
I feel terrible for Judy, like genuinely. Another character that I feel terrible for, but also I wanted to talk about just from like a structural standpoint is like, I don't know why Midge is in this movie.
She's a really interesting character.
Why is Midge here? And why does she disappear halfway through the movie?
It's really interesting. She's also just like an interesting setup of he doesn't live with her, does he?
No, he doesn't.
But he spends a lot of time at her house.
He goes over all the time.
Because they're friends from college, and they were engaged for like 2 or 3 weeks, and then she called it off.
Yeah.
And then...
And it's implied because he's on the police force? Like, you spend too much time at work? I don't know.
Yeah, but she's an interesting character in that way. And then she paints paints herself as Carlotta.
Yeah.
And then that makes him freak out, and she goes, stupid. And I'm like, no, that's not him, man. He's going through his own thing. Like,
right. So we're watching that movie, and we get to that scene, and I'm just like, what did you think was going to happen here, Mitch? Like, what was your end
What's your game here?
It's such a weird.
That's a weird
choice.
Scene. And then she drives past when Judy / Madeline is leaving, and she's like, was she? Oh, she also goes with him to see Pop.
Yeah. She goes and takes him to the bookshop to go see Pop.
Yeah.
But then the last we see of her is at like the mental institute or hospital or wherever he is.
Yeah.
And she's just like, yeah, he's in love. He was in love with her. He's still in love with her. And like, I don't think Mozart's going to help. And then she just disappears. Like, I don't know. It's just strange of watching it again this time. Like, I think in my head, I had like fabricated some scene where they get into an argument and she's like, no, I'm done. Like, I need to like step away.
Right.
But that just doesn't happen. She just disappears.
Which is so weird because you think from her character that she would be checking in with him.
Right.
And like, unless you read like, well, Mozart's not gonna, unless you read that as like her "I'm out" statement, which is a weak "I'm out" statement.
It's a really weak.
It's a really weak "I'm out" statement. Yeah, it's just weird. And like, obviously, I'm not like, well, Midge had some responsibility over him, but I'm like,
but it's just like
you're like his
so
only
invested.
friend, and you're super invested in this situation,
right?
That it's like weird when he actually starts doing some truly heinous shit that Midge isn't there to be like, hey, what? Like, what are you doing? Like, could have been a really interesting scene in which he introduces her to Judy, and she's like,
that's a huge red flag. What's going on, buddy?
Like, is this not the same person? But also, you're doing what? Like, that might help with like the audience knowing that we're not supposed to sympathize with him. If Midge was like, you're losing it, man. You know?
Have some outside voice of reason. It's just strange because like she is so integral to the first half, and like their dynamic is a weird one, but it's one that's shown up in other Hitchcock movies. Like it's very much the relationship between Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly in Rear Window.
It is. That's what I was thinking of.
Aren't they together?
Are they
like,
just kind of friends?
Yeah, it's that weird. He does that a lot, I've noticed, where it's sort of like this unspoken like sexual tension in history that is implied. And maybe that's like Code era stuff. Maybe like he's interested in talking about like domestic situationships
Yeah.
that like can't talk about it. I don't know, but
Yeah.
it did remind me a lot of like that dynamic of
Totally.
being confused as to what the relationship between these two people is.
I also saw some people, people have commented and they say that Midge is a lesbian, that she's gay. And I'm like, that's an interesting read.
Yeah,
But I don't really
maybe.
maybe.
I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, Midge is such a weird character that I think you could put anything on her and you
Yeah,
go, all
she's
right.
kind of a blank slate where you could kind of attach anything to her. And I think that's, again, coming back to what you were talking about of like, between either of these two films, there aren't really any, I don't want to use this term because it gets tossed around. It has such a connotation to it, like, strong female characters. There's just no like female characters in these movies.
No.
Like, they're there and they're the props for the backdrop of what's going on for like the male characters, which is,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just,
They are-
it's not like, I don't enjoy it personally, but
No.
again, you have to take it for being a product of the time and all those things. But it is interesting of just, I think that's kind of a wider discussion of what we're trying to do with the show, is we're looking at these movies that people have like held on to for 50 plus years or more as being like, this is where cinema peaked. And a lot of the time I look at them, I'm like, I don't know. There's like glaring things going on here that just don't need to be there. Like Midge disappearing halfway through the movie is like, I feel like that's a flaw. I think that's a fault of like this character who is so connected to your main character just disappears in the second half and we don't know why. There is no explanation. There's not even like a passing line of like, well, Midge moved away. Like Midge moved out of the city. Like there's nothing. Like he never acknowledges it. Nobody talks about it. And it's like, all right, we're going to unequivocally say that like, this is one of the greatest films of all time when there's something so structurally missing from it. And I don't want that to come across as like cinema sins plot brain.
See, and that was my big concern going into this is I was like, oh, I'm worried that it sounds like I'm just going,
no, and
hey,
like that's,
what happened? That doesn't make any sense,
Mhm. No, and it's not like a ding against the movie of like, oh, here's a gotcha that doesn't make sense. It's just something that stood out to me of like, that's a really strange choice character-wise that
Absolutely
is kind of taking me out as an audience member.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I don't know. Yeah, I think that your point of like peak cinema, which is a term that's thrown around mostly as a joke now with like, you see a movie and you go, wow, peak cinema. But like, that's real. Like people have put Citizen Kane and Vertigo at the top of the lists for a long time of like this is peak cinema.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, they look fantastic. They look incredible. So I guess you could have an argument on that level. Absolutely. But I just feel like, again, in a modern context, looking at that and saying that is still the best that we have achieved on story, on character, on like significance to our current culture, on all. It's like I don't know. Like, so a question that I asked you a little bit ago, like a month ago or so, where I was like, if aliens arrived on Earth, what would be your list of films that you would show them to convey humanity and art?
Oh, yeah.
And Vertigo and Citizen Kane did not make that list.
No, not at all.
And again, that's a very subjective question, but like, would you want to introduce... And again, I guess that's like... And I don't want to sound like I'm like, again, like keeping this cemented in one view, because obviously if you shift your view, you can see how Citizen Kane could be, maybe... one of, I do think it is an incredibly well-made movie, and it is incredible that, the cast were mostly new to acting, that it's Orson Welles' first, it's his directorial debut. But I don't know, like, what are we trying to get out of making lists of the best of cinema? What are we arguing for?
Yeah.
Are people saying that as in like, it's a great use of the form? Or are we saying as art, this is something that we want to make sure that people see and read and know as the best that we have achieved?
Right. I think like something's been on my mind a lot lately when we talk about like the need of lists and the needs of ranking and all of these things is like looking at other mediums. Because something that's very interesting, you and I have talked about this before, of like out of all artistic mediums, film is the youngest. Film is just barely, like we've just barely passed 100 years in the past like decade or two. Whereas like theater and painting and sculpture and music have been around for millennia. Like it goes so far back. And so because of that, I think like it's you have to start somewhere. And I'm sure that, like, I'm sure that there was a certain point in history where somebody's like, well, Christopher Marlowe is, the end all be all. Like, that is, we've peaked, right? But then when, with centuries behind us, people can unequivocally say, like, yeah, Shakespeare is, a pinnacle of literature and theater and, storytelling.
Yeah.
And when I think about, like, the best versions of Shakespeare that I've encountered, whether through film or theater or anything else, I always feel so much from them. And I don't feel that from either of these two movies. Like, they're interesting. Like, I think they're, again, technically they're really pretty to look at. Like, I love all the technical aspects of it. Like, I'm a big fan of, like, conveying meaning through how you're photographing something. And Citizen Kane is such a huge, trailblazer in that regard, of literally digging holes in the set 6 feet deep so that you can get a low angle shot to convey a sense of, like, larger than life when you're looking at Orson Welles. Like, that's really cool to me. And I think that's really interesting. But my starting point with films is always, like, what is the story being told to me and how am I connecting with the story? And on that front, Vertigo definitely takes the top spot out of these two because it's a really good mystery. Like, watching it again, I was like, this is very engaging. Like, it's a really good question going on. And then the twist completely changes everything you thought about the movie. That was something that kind of stood out this time around, was that the switch when you suddenly realize that Judy is Madeline reminded me of, like, the midpoint shift at Parasite, where it's like, this is a completely different movie now. And it's really cool. Like, it's really cool seeing that happen in 1958. And that part, like, I'm very invested in and very engaged with in a way that I'm not with the central mystery at the heart of Citizen Kane.
Because, again, the central mystery of Citizen Kane isn't the point of the movie. The movie isn't about what is Rosebud. If they were to make a Citizen Kane now, it might be something more like an investigative movie. They'd make it more about the journalistic team. They'd make it more about they're trying to figure out what Rosebud meant, and then you'd get maybe, like, you'd still get the flashbacks, but, like, and again, like, part of me is like, well, yeah, Citizen Kane would be better if it was that. But I can't say that because that's not what the movie was trying to be. The movie was trying to talk about a man who had everything and he wasn't happy. And he also lost some things. And I don't know, like, what? Maybe I don't understand Citizen Kane. I don't know.
And I don't know, maybe what would that's you say, the journey.
What would you, hey, the true Citizen Kane, the Rosebud was the friends we made along the way. What would you say these two movies are trying to get across? What do you think Citizen Kane is trying to accomplish, and what do you think Vertigo is trying to accomplish?
I feel like, and this is, again, we already put this disclaimer, everything here is subjective and opinion, and I don't know shit. I'm just telling you some of my thoughts and ramblings.
Yeah, please don't, please don't harass us and be like, well, you don't understand the historical context. And it's like, yeah, I don't. Sorry.
Okay, cool. Great. But I feel like what Citizen Kane is trying to do is, I think it's trying to, like, be the equivalent, like an American equivalent to a Greek tragedy, is what I feel like that movie is trying to do.
Absolutely.
Like, okay, here is somebody who has a certain set of ideals and a certain set of beliefs, and he's going to systematically let go of every single one of those in pursuit of power and wealth and autonomy. How do you think it does at that? I think it's mostly successful, but I think where it starts getting muddied is for me, the weakness is the strength everybody else pulls to, is that I feel like it would be easier to engage with if you didn't have the whole Hearst corollary going on. Right. Like, if this was completely made up, then I think I could grapple with it a little bit easier as is. But when I try to think about it in, like, context of the Hearst analogy, is like, okay, does Orson Welles think that Hearst was a good person who became a bad person? Does he think he's somebody who needs redemption or sympathy? I don't know. Yeah. So if you look at it as what about you? Well, sometimes I worry that I'm really bad at, like, understanding films. sometimes I worry that I'm just kind of an idiot. Does anyone else out there ever get that fear? That when you watch a movie and you walk out of a movie and you go, oh, am I just not getting it? Did I not read it correctly? Did I misread this? But I don't know, because I think
again, if you're, I don't know a whole, I mean, you're the one with the theater degree. With Greek tragedies, you don't have to like the character, right?
No.
You're not supposed
you
to,
don't.
really. Because, like, yeah.
It's like a cautionary tale.
Exactly.
That's mostly what it's there for.
Right.
It's not to be like, oh, look, Oedipus was such a good guy and this is what happened to him. It's just like, hey, don't mess around. This could be you.
Right. But with that context, if it is meant to be read as a Greek tragedy, are they saying, hey, don't purchase a newspaper, don't run for governor? Is it, I just feel like he's too removed from like lower class people for them to get the message. Like, I feel like, I don't know, do you remember, it's Greed, the silent film Greed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I almost feel like that does a better job of warning you against greed.
No, I think it does, but I think leaning back on that analogy of it being a Greek tragedy, most Greek tragedies are about people of higher station.
Okay.
Like, it doesn't have to be, oh, here's a lowly stonecutter and this is his life. Like, this is a king. And this is the things that happen to him.
Yeah. So if you were to remove the Hearst, the Hearst analogy, the Hearst, comparison and reference point, does it work better? Or
I think it works a little bit. Like, it's still not perfect and it's still not like, I don't care because I just don't like, it's not interesting to me. I don't care if, my mentality is very much just eat the rich. So I don't care what happens to good old Charlie Kane.
Right.
Like, the one emotionally connective piece, and I think this is why Rosebud is there, it just doesn't quite go all the way for me, is I do genuinely feel bad for a kid growing up in an abusive household whose mother sends him away on the urge of like, I need to get you away from your abusive father and we just came into money, so I'm going to put you over here where you're safe, even if that means being away from me. Like, that is an emotionally interesting nugget at the heart of the movie.
And that's what I texted you that. I was like, I think the closest I get to feeling an emotion over Kane is that. Is I'm like, wow, like, he doesn't understand why this is happening.
Yeah.
He doesn't understand it.
Right. And it's like, he's interesting in the sense of like, I do like seeing his views of like everyday people and not connect. Like, I wish there was more of a connection going on where he like is denying the entire time that he was an everyday person because he thinks he's so much more than that. Because there's a really great line when he's talking to Leland, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically Leland is like, yeah, well, the people you love so much are becoming something called organized labor, and you're going to wake up really quick to the fact that they feel that the rights are theirs to own rather than a gift you give them.
Yes.
And I'm like, that's really interesting.
That's really interesting. And again, for me, that's the second half of what he talks to Thatcher about when he's in like, his 40s or 50s, is he says, like, if I hadn't been born rich, then maybe I'd think I'd be a great man. He's like, you don't think you're a great man? He's like, I try to be, or something along those lines. And then he says, well, what would you have liked to have been? And Kane says, everything that you despise, which is a super cool line and very interesting to me of, okay, this is a man who recognizes that he wishes that he could be different. But that happens well before everything at the end. Right. And so I feel like, and again, I think that that's interesting, and obviously they're doing it out of order on, for a reason. And I think that's very interesting, but I think it kind of cuts short the ending for me.
Totally.
When at the end, he's like Rosebud, and I'm like, yeah, but I already knew that. I knew that you knew that.
Like you told us.
And again, I don't want it to sound like I'm saying, well, like they gave us, I could put it together before it happened. Cause that's the people who don't understand how mysteries work. Complaining about mysteries where it's like, I guessed the ending. It's like, yeah, you're supposed to.
Yeah, that's
But I just feel like, I don't know, something about it doesn't click for me in that way.
Do you have any other thoughts on like what you think it's trying to do?
What's interesting is that at the end, the other, I do like the ending a lot of Citizen Kane. I think it's fantastic. I love how that big room looks. I love how all the objects look. I love the reporters walking through it. I think that all looks amazing. And I really like that scene because I like it when one of the reporters goes, well, Thompson, where have you been all this time? What have you been doing? He's like, trying to learn about Rosebud. And they're like, well, did you learn anything about Kane or whatever? And he goes, not much. And he says he was a man who got everything he ever wanted. He
lost it all.
And then lost it all. And that's what he says. And I think that's a very, and we talked about this, that's a very interesting summation of the movie. But we don't see that. Because we see everything about him. you know, and like we see that, and again, like I don't know.
Yeah,
I feel like I could talk myself into liking it.
Sure,
but
there's
that's not
interesting
true.
stuff going on, but like, yeah, it's you and I have talked about this before. My litmus test for like a personal enjoyment of a movie is if I need to go watch a video essay to really like the movie, then I don't think that like I enjoyed the movie. Because there are the movies that I watch on the first time and just like it just clicks, like I get it. And, you know, I instantly love that movie and I connect with it on such a deep level. And like, there's so many layers that I can see in it already. But like, when I have to go digging and when I have to convince myself to like a movie, I have to just accept the fact that I'm like, okay, I just don't think that I personally like it all that much.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like, it can still be a great movie. And it is a great movie. I don't think it's the greatest movie of all time, but it is a great movie. Like, I think it's worth watching at least once.
Sure. But I'd be interested to hear from people. I'd be interested to have someone on the show at some point who really loves Citizen Kane.
Totally.
Because I'm curious. I'm curious what they're connecting with.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like all I ever hear when people say they love Citizen Kane is they're like, well, it's a very big and important movie, and it looks this way, and it did this, and I'm like, right, but do you like it?
Yeah, but do you like? Does it connect with you?
It's kind of the question. It's kind of like in Lady Bird, when Lady Bird is like talking to her mom, and she's like, "Do you like me?" And her mom's like, "I love you. I love you." And she's like, "Yeah, but do you like me?"
Right.
And I feel like that's how I feel about people liking Citizen Kane, where they're like, "Oh, I love that film. It does all of these things," and I'm like, "Yeah, but do you like it? Do you want to put it on?"
Yeah, you're like, is Citizen Kane somebody's comfort movie?
Like,
that's what I want to know.
Would you want to sit down and watch? Like, do you just go, I just really need to watch Citizen Kane tonight?
Yeah.
And again, that doesn't mean that you have to. I'm not saying that the greatest movie of all time has to be like endlessly rewatchable. I think that there are a lot of great movies, Vertigo, for example, that are really great, but you don't want to watch them all the time.
No.
But anyone out there who says Citizen Kane is like, they love that film, I'm like, what do you love about it? What do you like about it? Because I feel like it's just one of those things where you go, yeah, I mean, it's really great, but I don't like it.
There are movies I don't like watching that I love because of like how intense they are, right? Like I love Schindler's List. And the reason I love Schindler's List is because it just connects me back to my humanity.
Absolutely.
Like there's just an aching humanness to that movie. But I can only watch it every 10 years. Like, it's one of those things of like, I have to revisit it and then I have to recover because it is just so intense and it's heavy and I don't like watching it in that way, right? But I love it. So like, I think that's a kind of comparison of like, there are movies that are big and important movies that don't have to be endlessly rewatchable so long as there's something about them that like you personally are connecting with. So you're right. I would love to have somebody on the show who feels that way about this movie. I'd be fascinated to know like what they're connecting with.
But okay, enough about Citizen Kane.
See, but like keep in mind that like this first episode is really 2 episodes pushed into one. Because like we're doing a Citizen Kane episode and we're doing a Vertigo episode.
Yeah,
so like future episodes will be a little bit more contained to a specific topic.
And if we had been smart, maybe we would have opened with a Citizen Kane episode.
Maybe, but
I don't want to spend that whole episode talking about Citizen Kane.
That sounds like a lot. So coming back to your original question of like, what do you think Vertigo is trying to do?
It's trying to unsettle you. It's trying to, it's a mystery. So it's trying to draw you in. And I think it does a very good job of that. I think that initial setup of, and we talked about this because, you know, we're both ghost lovers. We love a good ghost.
We love a good spook.
We love a ghost movie, you know? And so I love that the opening of this movie is, do you believe in ghosts? And he's like, no. And he's like, what if I told you there was a ghost haunting my wife? And he'd be like, wow, I'd send you to the hospital. You know, and it's like, follow her. And I love that because then it's like, and again, it's interesting, like you were saying earlier, of that shift when, you know, when Judy's writing out the letter to him that she tears up and she explains everything, which I think is very interesting. And like the first time I saw it, I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? This all was like an act. I mean, you can kind of, it makes sense when you look back on it because how possibly could she have not noticed this car following her everywhere? And he, you know, but you know, you have to, you know, that's that CinemaSins thing that I'm going to avoid doing because when a movie tells you this is the rules of the world, you have to go with it.
You just have to go with it.
You have to accept, you go, all right, the rules of the world is.
Which is why I don't count the Midge thing as like a plot hole ding. Because
exactly.
I'm like, it's not explained to the rules of the world. It's just a weird choice.
Yeah. It's just a really odd choice to cut this like third main character out of the movie halfway through and not explain it at all. But I think it does a very good job of drawing you in of like, well, what is she doing? Like, what is this? Is this a ghost? Like, who is this? Is she just mentally unwell? Like, we don't know. And then I think, again, then it shifts into, well, now we're just going to try and like unsettle you. And you're going to be really uncomfortable for the next 40 to 50 minutes, you know?
Right.
And I think that works very well. I am very unsettled to the point that I kind of skipped through some of the Judy stuff at the end because I remembered it and I didn't want to watch it again. I didn't want him to be like, you gotta get you gotta get this dress fitted. And it's like, I don't need to see that again. That's fine.
No, it's a lot. Like we were watching that scene and like, you know, when they're going back up the tower and he's just like manhandling Judy, Kate was just like, oh wow, like this is really intense. Like this is really, you know, scary. It's scary. Not what I expected.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, absolutely. Like I think it is doing like I think that's a fair analysis. How well do you think it's doing that? Like if its goal is to unsettle you?
I think it's very good at making you uncomfortable. I think that down to the casting of Jimmy Stewart and having him act so against type, that's a brilliant choice. I think that's really great.
I feel very similarly. Like it was interesting because I watched it with Kate and we also had one of our friends come over and watched it with us. And afterwards he was like, I really like the movie. He's like, I don't know why it's called Vertigo. Cause like, yeah, he has vertigo, but like, that's really like, it's more of like a plot device. And my 2 cents was like, well, it's called Vertigo because vertigo isn't a feeling. It's discombobulating. It's disorienting. It's, you know, dizzying, right? And I was like, the movie is doing that to you. Like it is very disorienting to watch this movie. So like, I think that's why the title exists and is there, right?
Yeah.
So I would agree. I think like it feels like that's what the movie is trying to do the most. There could maybe be an interpretation and a read of like it being a cautionary tale against obsession. But I feel like that's only the second half of the movie. There's not a whole lot of like breadcrumb trail of like, that's what I find so interesting about Scotty is that character shift seems entirely motivated by like one traumatic event, which totally makes sense and it works fine. But for me, that's where like when people talk about it being a movie about like obsession, I'm like, not really. Cause like Scotty isn't obsessive in the first half. It's the second half, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I like to latch on more to like, what is it trying to do emotionally and thematically, which is, I would agree. I think it's meant to be disorienting and confusing. And to your point about like how it opens, I like the movie as is, and I wouldn't really change much about it. I think it's an interesting mental exercise sometimes to look at movies and be like, well, what would you change? What would you make different? But like at that point, it's a different movie, right?
Yes.
Like it's not Vertigo anymore. In that same way of like, I want to see a movie that takes the central premise of my wife is possessed by a ghost and go follow her and follow that through to the natural conclusion of actually being like a supernatural thriller. Like that would be a really cool movie. I don't want Vertigo to be that movie, but like that's an interesting movie.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very good hook. It's a very interesting hook to be like a ghost. And you're like, yeah, I mean, I won't say no to a ghost. And then as it goes along, you're like, oh, it isn't a
ghost.
And I think we just have to mention that the nightmare sequence is incredible.
It's great.
Absolutely stunning. I completely forgot that it was coming up and that it started, and I was just, oh man, it's amazing. It's amazing. It's incredible. It is.
And like, it's crazy because so many people remember Hitchcock for being a horror director, but like, the only like completely out and out 100% horror movie is Psycho.
Yeah.
But all of them have elements of it, right? Because that was the thing that was really interesting to me watching this again is I remember when I watched it really young. I probably watched it when I was like 14 for the first time. And I distinctly remember something about it really scaring me. And I'm watching the movie and I was like, it's not the nightmare sequence. Like the nightmare sequence is kind of trippy and off-putting, but like I was more engaged with that and like interested in that than scared. And I'm watching the movie and it just keeps going and going. I'm like, maybe I made it up. Maybe there wasn't anything scary here. And then there's like the second to last shot of the movie is Judy looks over his shoulder and she sees like this dark figure standing up and moving towards her. I'm like, oh, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, that scares the shit out of me. Like that's what it was. It's that one shot of like, and then it's revealed to be like the nun coming up to check on them. But like the nun in total darkness and just like that shape of her habit going down into like her cloak is horrifying. Like, it's so scary.
Sure. Interesting.
Yeah.
She says at the same time as she's coming out, doesn't she say, "I heard noises"? Or is that right?
It's
So-
right. No, so she comes out, Judy screams and falls, and she goes, "I heard noises."
Oh,
It's like
I
the
thought
next
that it was.
shot.
I thought it was like. Oh man, I misremembered that.
It's
because I was
not
thinking
as
that
she's walking up.
Okay, because I was thinking, I was like, it wasn't that scary for me because as she comes out, she says, "I heard noises."
No, it's literally so like the
Okay.
sequence of events is that there's a shot of Judy, there's the shot of the
Gotcha.
nun walking in darkness, there's the shot of Judy screaming, and then
Yeah.
it cuts back to the nun and she says, "I heard voices."
And then gotcha.
So that's why it's scary the first time I watched it, because I'm like, what is that? Who is that? Like, is it the husband?
Yeah.
Like, is it actually a ghost?
That's something else about this movie that's wild to me, is that they're just like, and also Gavin killed his wife.
Yeah.
And you're
isn't that
like,
wild.
okay, I guess I'll just take your word for that. Like, and they just kind of brush past that because that's not what the movie's about. I'm like, someone else died. Like a real woman died.
Mhm.
She was killed. And I just think that's wild. I don't know. Like, it doesn't really mean, it's not a knock on the movie. It's just like, wow.
Right. Yeah,
There's a
just
lot going on here.
There's a lot going on right now. Absolutely.
I don't know. One thing about it, it reminds me a lot of the ending of North by Northwest as well, is that the endings of these are insanely fast.
Oh, totally.
Like, there's
They
a
just
build-up,
end.
a build-up, a build-up, and then it's like Judy falls. Or like, they're on top of Mount Rushmore, cut to, they're on a train and they're married. The end.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait, what? What was that?
Which is interesting because, like, I don't think he ever finds his equilibrium, right? Because this is 2 years before Psycho, and Psycho has the opposite problem because the ending just drags. It just goes on forever.
Psycho's like the one movie where you didn't need to explain anything or like have an ending thing, and then they spend like 15 minutes of the detective being like, well, you see, he was... and you're like, okay, we get it, we know.
Yeah, we got it.
Didn't have to
But
do
yeah,
all
so
this.
many of the others are like instantly over. Like
Yeah.
even The Birds is like that too. Like The
Wow.
Birds, they just get in their car and leave, and then it's over, and you're like, okay, cool. That's the end of the movie, I guess.
All right. Are you satisfied by Vertigo's ending?
No, I don't think so.
I'm
Like,
not
it's-
either.
Like I think it works. Like I get why it's there.
Yeah.
But when I think about it, I'm just like, this doesn't seem like a satisfactory conclusion. Like, I think, and this is, awful, and it's a much more morbid version. I think it would almost work better if Scotty pushed her. Like, if Scotty
Yeah.
deliberately kills her,
Yeah.
I think maybe the ending would feel a little bit more like narratively cohesive, thematically cohesive.
Yeah. And like him saying, like, I made it. I
Mhm.
made, like, that's a very interesting, like, turn for him. I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
it's just, and like, way to go, Jimmy Stewart, of making that like the most unsettling thing to say at
Totally.
that moment of like, he realizes that he made it up.
Uh-huh.
And it's just like, anyways. Yeah, I don't know. I think I agree with you. I think that could have been very interesting.
Like, the stumble and fall accident just feels odd to me. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and also it kind of makes the nun thing kind of comical for me because she
Kind
falls
of.
and it cuts back to the nun and then the nun just goes like, God bless her. And you're like,
Yeah.
what are you doing?
Uh-huh.
She just fell. Like, you're not going to freak out. You're just like,
Mhm.
I heard noises. God bless her. God bless her soul. And it's like, what?
What are you
Did
talking
you do that
about?
on purpose?
Yeah.
It feels like you aren't that shocked by this happening.
Well,
I
I
don't-
mean, to be fair, somebody fell a year ago, so she's like
That's-
another one. That's another thing that's kind of odd about this movie. I'm not gonna. I desperately don't want this to sound like some sort of plot holding. It's just observations. It's just
Yes.
things
No.
I noticed this time.
Absolutely.
Of the time jump isn't really clear. I think the only thing I got context clue is that at the hospital, the doctor says could be 6 months, could be as long as a year. And then at a certain point later, when he's talking to Judy, Scotty says, this is the happiest I've been in a year.
See, I missed that. I didn't realize, on both watches, I didn't realize it was a year.
Yeah.
I didn't know
I
how
only
long
picked
had
up on
been.
it this time.
For some reason, I felt it had been a few weeks because she was
And
still
I
in
think
the
the
city.
only reason I caught it is because we were watching it with subtitles.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I would have missed it otherwise. Because that was another thing that I just like, I don't know. The second half of the movie is just odd. I don't know. Like, it's good. Like, there's a lot of really great stuff going on, but it feels so disconnected from the first half in a lot of
It
ways.
does, because it tells you the mystery right at the start of the second half. It gives you all the answers. But he doesn't learn that until later, which creates suspense. It's Hitchcock's bomb in the trunk. It's, and you're watching him slowly get more and more attached to this until he realizes. And then you go, well, this isn't going to go very well.
I was surprised watching it again this time how soon that reveal happens. Because I
Yes.
remember it being there, but I was like, it's this early? Like,
Yeah.
we find out that, wow. Like, I was surprised. How
Yeah, it's after
quickly
their
we found
first
out.
encounter in the room, right? He leaves and then she sits down to write the letter, right?
Yeah, well, not, yeah. So, like, he leaves and she's like staring at the wall, and then it flashes back to what happened that day.
Right. Okay, gotcha. Yes, that's what it was. Yeah. I think I'm much more satisfied by Citizen Kane's ending.
Interesting.
Obviously, I don't think that it works in that I feel bad for him, or that I feel like if only he had Rosebud, because also he has Rosebud. Or is that a remake of the sled? The thing that they burn at the end, is that
I think
the
it's
sled?
The sled.
Is because I
don't know.
Because I text when I was texting you, I was like, what? I'm supposed to feel bad that he doesn't have the sled? He has the sled,
Yeah, he does.
but he didn't know that he had it, or is it just he's saying that as like, I wish I could go back to when Rosebud meant the most to me.
I've always read it more as like I want to go back rather than like I need my sled. I don't think it's a one-to-one like bring me my sled in my dying moments.
Right. No, but I think that I like the burning of Rosebud. I like the music during it. I love the dramatic.
Goes hard
of,
as a title.
It does.
The burning of Rosebud. That goes hard.
There you go. That's our. There you go. That's the
coming to the Criterion Collection, fall 2023.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like I feel like that build up and that kind of, again, it's kind of like, oh man, it's right there and they'll never find it. And I just think that that's very fun. Of like the audience gets to know what Rosebud was, but the reporters never find out. And again, I think that it would work better. And I'm not, again, like you're saying, I'm not trying to say that I could have written Citizen Kane better. I think the movie should have been this, because that's something that I've had to learn the last little bit of, like coming out of a movie and going, well, that's not what I was hoping it would be. And not knocking the movie for that. Of like, that's just something that's been really interesting for me to learn in the last year of like, oh, I would have liked it to be this. Right. But it's like, but it's not that. And knocking a movie on, well, I would have done it differently it's a valid way to feel, but I don't think it's a great way to criticize a movie or to review a movie.
I completely agree.
Of like, well, it's not doing that. So what do you think of it as is? But I do think that Citizen Kane would be interesting. And again, I think that, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier of like, well, if Thompson were more of a character. But I think that the point of Thompson is he's mostly in silhouette. He's mostly viewed from behind. He's supposed to be like an audience surrogate, I feel.
Sure.
A little bit, like he's not that much of a character. You could read it that way. I'm not saying that is how it is, but that's how I was seeing it the second time, was like, okay, well, Thompson's supposed to be like intentionally left vague or like as a non-character just because he serves as a function to go around and talk to everybody and get the story. But I do think that there is a version of Citizen Kane that's very interesting to me, which is it centers him trying to find the answer of what is Rosebud, and he actually kind of gets caught up in it.
Yeah.
And at the end, and that makes the burning of Rosebud, coming to the Criterion Collection in 2023, the burning of Rosebud a much more interesting ending of like, if we are personally more involved and like invested in them trying to figure it out, of like, oh, it was right there, but that's not what it's trying to do. But I do think that ending is a lot more, I enjoy that ending more. Again, I think that the buildup in Vertigo is very exciting and very suspenseful and like tense, and you hate to see it. You hate to see it. You hate to see Jimmy Stewart handling a woman and yelling at her, and then she falls off a tower. But like, I think that giving us a little bit more of room to breathe with that, maybe, I don't know. But then with Citizen Kane, I have much less of like, I enjoy that ending more because it feels more like fitting to what the movie is. I don't know.
I can see that. No, I can see that. I think everything leading up to the final moment in Vertigo is much more engaging and like thrilling and exciting and like it invests you. But like the actual like narrative ending moment of her falling off the tower and dying versus them burning Rosebud, I agree. I think the ending of Citizen Kane works better for me than the ending of Vertigo.
I think that the buildup is different. I think that the ending of Citizen Kane would be a lot better if there was more of like, I don't know, not even establishing of it, but just like, if I liked what came before it more, I think that I'd be much happier with it. But I do think that I like that ending as is with the movie that it's trying to be than I do with Vertigo's ending with the movie that Vertigo's trying to be.
Well, I also like, just thinking about it now, again, obviously, to your point before, like, it doesn't do much good to be like, well, I would have done this different, because you're talking about a different movie at that point, right? So like, it's not a knock against the movie at all, but just an interesting conversation point of like, trying to suss out what I don't like about the ending of Vertigo
Yeah.
is that it feels unrelated to Scotty's journey other than just like a tragic ending to Obsession. Whereas if you kept everything the same, but he accidentally stumbles and falls and dies, that could maybe connect back to like the beginning of the movie in a much stronger way.
Right.
For me.
Yeah.
But again, that's not the movie that exists, but like it's an interesting thought.
That is kind of what you were saying earlier about how Vertigo isn't really about obsession, at least not for the first half.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the movie to be like, what is Scotty? Obviously at the end he gets to say, I made it. And that's like a thing where it's like, wow, you did it. You climbed this tower out of like, spite and anger and like obsession.
Mm-hmm.
But like, there's nothing really that happens to him at the end.
Right.
He makes it up the tower, but that's not what he was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like he spent the whole movie going, well, and I can't wait until I get to go to the top of that tower. You know, it's not like
right. But I mean, that is kind of like, but that is for the first half of the movie. Like that entire scene with Midge is him trying to get over his fear of heights.
Yes.
He's like, hey, I'm going to go a bit at a time.
Yes.
I'm going to go progressively get higher. And then he looks out the window and it's too much for him. So like, obviously it's not a one-to-one with the tower, but he is trying to do that.
He is. And then he gets up there. But is like what we're supposed to take away is like, right, but and I guess we don't have to take anything away from it other than, holy, wow, look at that. Look at what just happened. That's crazy. But like, whoa. At the end, it's like he makes it. What does that mean for his character? Because he hadn't been trying to, is it saying, because again, if you look at it, well, he couldn't make it up the tower to save Madeline the first time. And that's like a big thing for him. It's like, well, I couldn't make it up the tower. But like they counted on that. They counted on him not being able to make it up the tower for that whole plan to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then with this ending, what is it trying to say? What is it trying to say? What do you think it's about him making it? Is it that he lost sight of what he was really trying to do, which was make it up a tower? No, I'm kidding.
I don't. Yeah,
I don't. We're not left with like, and I get it. We don't need the detective at the end of Psycho to be like, well, and you see,
right,
Scotty. It's like we don't need that, but I do think that leaving him on the ledge, not even in a close up, like we can't even really see. Like he looks maybe a bit sad about it, does he?
Yeah.
What do you read from him in that moment? Is he sad?
I've always read it as sad. I've read it as, oh, I messed up. Like I went too far.
Right.
That's what I've always read from that expression.
Which is what he should take away from it.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same way that he didn't notice that he got so far up the tower, he didn't notice that he'd gotten that far in. You could make that correlation.
Yeah.
You know?
He hadn't really like...
What I do
know
is that Judy didn't have anything to do in this movie except suit him. And then at the end she dies. And it's sad, but it's mostly it just makes the whole movie kind of a bummer.
Yeah, it's like it's so weird, right? Because I find Judy's character very interesting in the sense that like she writes that whole letter explaining everything.
Yeah.
And then she rips it up because she's like, well, I'm in love with him as he is, and maybe I can make him fall in love with me as I am. Like maybe we can just leave this Madeline stuff behind. Because I just love him so much. And I'm like, that's interesting. It doesn't really go anywhere other than her giving up on that after he's, insistent about it.
Right. We can't really revisit that and again, it's what the movie is, but it's her. She basically is just like, well, as long as I'm making you happy, right? Is that kind of what it is?
That
she
it seems like that.
Herself.
She does, and she gets to this weird equilibrium with it. The scene before they drive up to the mission is like, she's like, oh, I feel like I finally have you. Like, you're finally mine, and isn't this wonderful?
But it's like, no, it's not.
You don't.
Because
like, you gave up everything.
And I guess that's part of the tragedy of it, I hope.
Yeah.
I hope we're supposed to be like, wow, that sucks that she gave up what she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's kind of, it's hints of Grease for me, where at the end it's like, isn't it great that they both changed? It's like, no, she sacrificed her values for this guy, for this guy.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds weird because like I'm harping on this ending, but I'm genuinely glad it's not a happy ending, because that would be the message of like, oh, hey, like she changed herself and he got his obsession, and isn't that wonderful? Like, that's not an ending I want. That's not the message to take away. But I do like, it is lamentable to me that the only conclusion of this is that this poor woman who was like taken advantage of by a millionaire essentially and extorted, and like, you know, that's the other, it's not really clear what their arrangement was. Like, she says that he paid her as like, I guess she just needed money.
Yeah.
But like, how much money? Because she's still living in that dingy hotel.
Well, and that's the thing. I'm like, why are you still here? Like, why are you? I guess because you wanted to make him fall in love with you again. Mm-hmm. But like, yeah, you're still living there. Like, that's
I don't know. I just like, that's the biggest takeaway is I just feel terrible for Judy. I just feel so bad that she got mixed up with this millionaire who wanted to kill his wife and have an out for it. Yeah. And she's just like, yeah, I'll go along and do that. And then she falls in love with the detective investigating her. She sticks around, changes for the guy, and then she stumbles and falls and dies. Like, that's...
Well, in fairness, a nun did show up, and that's very scary.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. A nun can do that too.
Maybe this movie's about how religion will... No. But yeah, I think again, not trying to change the ending, but just talking about an interesting alternative to the ending is if Scotty falls instead of her. Mm-hmm. That's interesting for his character, where it's like, well, he was so obsessed that he didn't even realize he made it up the tower. Mm-hmm. And then it was too late for him. Right. Like, if you made the I made it moment more of like a, wow, like, but also like more of like a realization moment, and then he falls. Sure. I think that would be a very ironic and fitting end for this man of like, wow, like you used to be a somewhat decent man who had vertigo, and then you didn't even realize that you made it up this tower, which is what you wanted to do in the first place because you were so distracted by this obsession that you fell, that you now are falling, which was your greatest fear.
And it feels like, tying it back to other Hitchcock films, it feels like if the ending of Rear Window is that like Grace Kelly falls out a window and breaks her leg because of him spying on this guy. Right. Rather than like the guy coming to his door and like, finally, his actions have consequence for him and he's in danger. Yeah. It feels like that. It's like, okay, we're focusing so much on Scotty's emotional journey and obsession and, dealing with vertigo and that I made it moment you're talking about. But like, Judy's the one who gets the comeuppance for that. That doesn't connect to me for some reason. Unless
you read it as she is not a character. She is a prop for him. She is something that he possesses, in which case he did suffer a great loss because of his obsession. He pushed her too far and he lost her. Yeah. Which I unfortunately think is the reading of the movie.
I think that feels the most accurate.
To the time and to Hitchcock is, well, sucks for you. It's not that he loses his life. It's that he loses his
because isn't that so much worse?
Isn't that so much worse that he has to now live with the fact that he lost his possession?
Which, I mean, that's been a trope for centuries. So just like, we're going to kill the woman to like add character growth for the man.
He has just started his journey after, we fridged Judy and now he's going to go on some great rehabilitation arc that we don't get to see.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. It's like, again, it's so weird because we spent so much time talking about how we don't like the ending, but I do genuinely like the movie more than I like.
I do. I do. It looks like a dream. It's a horrible dream, Vertigo. Yeah. Vertigo's this weird off. It's so dreamlike, just in how, and especially when they go to Mur Woods, that whole sequence is like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, how much of this is a set? How much of this is rear projection? Like, I can't really tell, and it's kind of dreamlike, and I really do. I like Vertigo more, but I think for me, it's much closer than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, which is surprising. Like, coming into the podcast, I fully expected that I was like, we're just going to dunk on Citizen Kane and we're going to be like, Vertigo's great, isn't it? But like, talking through it now, it's closer than I thought it was. Yeah. Not in the best way.
Not in the best way. I think that they both kind of have their kind of faults and their flaws in their stories that they're trying to tell. Yeah. But I think that they both look incredible and they're both very nice to watch in that. Not comforting. It's not I'm not going to rewatch Vertigo or I'll probably end up watching Citizen Kane a few more times this year. Sure. But like, They're very nice to watch. They're pleasant to look at.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. That's very interesting, and I didn't really anticipate them being so, kind of close.
Yeah, I didn't either, which is interesting. So coming back to like our 3 criteria,
Yes.
let's go through both of them.
Yes.
So starting with Citizen Kane, first criteria being like technical jumps or historical significance. That feels like an absolute.
I think it beats Vertigo.
Sure.
I mean, Vertigo
I think it
introduces again, kind of pioneers the Zolly shot, sort of, the Vertigo shot.
Yeah.
But I do think Citizen Kane, it really holds up. Like
Totally.
they both hold up so well, but Citizen Kane especially is, for being 1941.
Yeah.
Like that's pretty fresh in film history.
No, I think Citizen Kane does take the cake there, and I like again, listeners, we're still figuring this out.
We're still figuring out the show,
but I kind of like pitting them against each other and seeing which one gets best 2 out of 3.
Yeah.
So I think that's a point for Citizen Kane. I think Citizen Kane gets the technical and historical point.
Yeah.
How well it's doing what it's trying to do.
I don't think it works for me as well as Vertigo does.
I was gonna say, I feel like Vertigo takes that one for me just because it is, like you said, it's a beautiful nightmare.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's a perfect description of that movie, and it's doing it so well.
I mean, it's so many shots in that are so famous, but the shot of her against the green light window is such a perfect, like, beautiful nightmare.
Totally.
Shot,
and even the stuff that isn't stylized like that, like the big one that kind of took my breath away was when she's parked under the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's just like stretching on to infinity.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous.
And it's got like this just glow to it. Like, I don't know. I should have done more research and prep. Like, I imagine they're doing something to the lens, whether they're putting Vaseline on it or maybe like sticking like, something over it, some silk or something over the top of the lens to get that like haze to it. It's so pretty.
It's so pretty.
Despite our problems with the ending, I do think that Vertigo is doing a better job at what it's trying to do.
Yes.
So I think that's 1 point to Vertigo.
And also, I just want to clarify, once we kind of figured out the ending of like, oh, well, he loses her. That's what it's trying to do. I may not agree with it, but that's what it's saying. I think that ending works.
Totally.
That ending is doing a good job of like consequences for him. It's just that I disagree with what the consequence should have been.
Sure.
I simply think Judy shouldn't have lost her life just so that a man feels bad.
I hate the fact that I feel like that's a phrase we're going to be saying a lot on the show when we're talking about movies. Is I really wish that terrible things didn't have to happen to these female characters for the men.
Yeah, just so that the men feel bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. And then third, do you have anything more to say on that second category?
No, I think that's 1 point for each. And then third category being just our subjective one. Do
you like it? I mean, you said it early in the show.
Yeah, we've talked about, everybody, if you didn't want to listen to the whole episode, you could probably just scrub to the first third and hear me say that I like Vertigo better. TLDL, Vertigo better than Citizen Kane.
Vertigo better. I do and again, I will say once again, though, it's much closer than I thought it was going to be.
Totally.
I went into Vertigo being like, I remember loving this. I remember like really enjoying this. And then I just, I think they're both pretty great. I think that they're both pretty great. I do think that Vertigo is better. It's better than Citizen Kane. And hey, at the end of the day, do you know what the only thing I can really say about Vertigo, do you know what it is? Wow. Madeleine sure does drive her car a lot of places. I wrote that down. It's written down. I wrote it in my notebook, and then afterward I wrote LOL LMAO. I thought it was pretty funny.
That's good. See, the closest thing I had to that, and I didn't write it down because I was like, this is a bad joke. And so I left it to die.
You can always count me to not let bad jokes die. I need to share them immediately.
But I just had a vision in my head of the poster for Gone Girl, but it's Vertigon Girl.
Oh, very.
And it's just, they put Kim Novak's face on it.
Yeah.
Feels like somewhat narratively connected.
I get it. Yeah, that's a funny joke, Parker.
No, that's
really funny, Parker. You're so funny. No, I like that.
What you didn't do is you didn't share your Letterboxd review, which is a better joke. Max, share your Letterboxd review with the
My
with
Letterboxd
the listeners.
review is it's Madeleine, and then it's the shaking hands emoji, and then it's Herbie, and they're shaking hands over trying to drown in the San Francisco Bay.
There it is. Beautiful.
I tried to think of so many wordings of that joke. Because when I saw the bridge, I was like, oh, my review should be something like, hey, that's where Herbie tried to drown himself. Like, that's what I'm pointing out in the movie. I'm like, hey, like every time I see the Golden Gate Bridge, it's not, that's the Golden Gate Bridge. It's, oh, wow.
Wow.
Hey, that's where Herbie tries to kill himself in 10 years. 10 years after Vertigo, Herbie's there. I like to think they're in the same world. He's there.
Same place.
Same place. Anyways, yeah. Great.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, first episode on the books.
Yeah. Great. Now we're going to do a quick talk back.
Yeah.
We're gonna
We've
actually had a live audience here this whole time. They haven't laughed once.
No,
they don't
not a bit.
So hopefully they have a lot to say.
Absolutely. But yeah, so this is our first episode. Very exciting. We now have, one on the books. We're going to be keeping track of this as we go, of what movies we deemed to be better, what movies we deemed to be worse.
Yes.
And do we have a secret third option? Are we doing a tie at any point? Or
I
does
think
it have to be one or the other?
I think, well, it's fun to force ourselves into saying whether it's better or worse. Mm-hmm. But I mean, just in like our little warm-ups and our mental exercises that kind of developed this show.
Sure.
We ran into quite a few movies where we went, that's pretty equal.
Yeah.
So I think we'll find out once we reach a movie that is that. I think we'll determine whether we're going to allow ourselves to get off free from that.
Totally.
Or force ourselves to say it's better or worse. Because I think both are fun.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah.
Well, if you've stuck around this long and you're interested in hearing more, we will be doing more of these. The next episode we are going to be recording is Forrest Gump.
We're going to talk about Forrest Gump.
We're going to talk about Forrest Gump, ladies and gentlemen, which should be quite a ride.
I've only seen that once, and I was 14, and it was like New Year's Eve. Because I came back from a New Year's dance, and it was on TV, and my dad was watching it. And I feel like that's the way that Forrest Gump is meant to be seen. No.
See, I watched it for the first time because a girl I was dating said we should watch the movie, and we watched the movie in college. So that was my first experience with Forrest Gump.
I simply feel like if someone came to me and said, we have to watch Forrest Gump, I would probably say, no.
Max, you came to my house and said, we have to watch Herbie Rides Again.
We did, and we do, and we're gonna finish that.
We're gonna finish
we
the
just
quadrilogy.
I'm just giving you and Kate some time.
Perfect. I need a breather.
Quadrilogy. Is there 5? There's 6.
Is there 6? Oh,
There's technically 6 if you count the TV movie. Anyways,
is that including Fully Loaded?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Look, I'll list them off for you right now. And Will, you can cut here, but I'm going to keep going. No, but it's The Love Bug, Herbie Writes Again, Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo, Herbie Goes Bananas, The Love Bug 1997, and then Herbie Fully Loaded.
I see. Well then.
Yeah. And then don't forget Herbie Has Vertigo, which is Vertigo, but it's just got him in there.
Herbie Vertigo.
Oh, whoa. Herbie Vertigo's Bananas. All right, this is nothing. Will, make sure you actually cut that out.
Yeah. Well, in any case, thank you all for listening. We appreciate it. Hope to have you tune into the next one. Thanks so much, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much.